There's a moment in every person's life when they have to choose between their principles and their survival. Most of us never face that choice. But in early California, that choice came every single day. And here, that's what nobody tells you, almost everyone broke. You want to believe you'd be different. You want to think that if you'd landed in 1850s California, you'd have kept your morals intact, stayed honest, helped your neighbors, done the right thing. But you wouldn't have. The evidence is overwhelming. Good people, genuinely good people who came west with strong moral convictions, turned into monsters within months. Ministers abandoned their faith. Abolitionists bought slaves. Men who'd never stolen anything in their lives became thieves and murderers. And the worst part, they had to. Because early California didn't just make immorality possible, it made immorality mandatory. This isn't a story about bad people doing bad things. This is about how an entire system can take normal human beings and systematically destroy their ability to distinguish right from wrong. It's about how scarcity, lawlessness, and desperation don't just change behavior, they rewire morality itself. They make cruelty feel necessary. They make theft feel justified. They make murder feel reasonable. Early California was a laboratory experiment in moral collapse, and the results were horrifying. Within a few years, a society that started with churches and moral codes had devolved into something that barely qualified as civilization. People stopped seeing each other as human beings and started seeing each other as obstacles or resources. Compassion became a weakness you couldn't afford. Honesty became a luxury that got you killed. By the time you finish this documentary, you'll understand exactly how early California broke human morality. You'll see the specific mechanisms, the pressures, the incentives, the impossible choices that turned ordinary people into versions of themselves they never imagined they could become. And you'll be grateful you never had to find out who you'd become under those conditions. To understand how California broke people's morality, you need to understand the specific conditions that created the breaking point. We're talking about the period from 1848 to the mid-1860s, though the moral damage extended far beyond that. January 1848, James Marshall discovers gold at Sutter's Mill. Within months, word spreads globally. By 1849, the rush is on. Over the next few years, more than 300,000 people from around the world descend on California. These aren't colonists coming to build communities. These are fortune seekers coming to extract wealth as quickly as possible and leave. That mindset, temporary, extractive, individualistic, is the first crack in the moral foundation. Think about what California was before this invasion. It was a sparsely populated territory that had just been seized from Mexico. There was no established American government, no functioning legal system, no infrastructure, no social institutions. The Mexican period had its own problems, but at least it had some structure. When the Americans flooded in, they didn't bring structure with them. They brought chaos. The geography made everything worse. California was isolated from the rest of the United States by thousands of miles of deadly terrain. If you came overland, you crossed deserts that killed people by the dozen and mountains that trapped and starved entire wagon trains. If you came by sea, you sailed for months around Cape Horn through storms that sank ships regularly. Either way, once you arrived, you were cut off. There was no going back easily. There was no calling for help. You were trapped in whatever California became, and what it became was a moral vacuum. See, societies need certain things to maintain ethical behavior: family structures, community bonds, religious institutions, legal systems, economic stability, and the expectation of a shared future. Early California had none of these. Family structures. Most of the people flooding into California were young, single men with no families to answer to and no intention of settling down. They had no wives to civilize them, no children to protect, no elders to respect. They were untethered from the social relationships that normally enforce moral behavior. Community bonds. People were constantly moving, chasing rumors of new strikes. Mining camps appeared overnight and vanished just as fast. You might live next to someone for a week, then never see them again. There was no stability, no long-term relationships, no reputation to maintain. You could wrong someone today and be gone tomorrow, so what stopped you? Religious institutions. Oh, ministers came to California, but many of them abandoned their ministries to mine for gold because they were starving on their church salaries. The ones who stayed found their congregations disappearing into the hills. Church attendance collapsed because working on Sunday meant more gold, and gold was the only thing that mattered. Legal systems, completely absent in most places. The miners created their own courts, but these were just mob rule with a gavel. Verdicts were based on popularity and power, not evidence or law. Real courts existed in San Francisco and Sacramento, but they were so corrupt that justice was literally for sale. Economic stability, non-existent. Prices fluctuated wildly. A man could be wealthy one day and destitute the next. There was no safety net, no saving system that worked, no way to build long-term security. Everything was gambling and the house always won. The expectation of a shared future. Nobody had that. Everyone thought they'd strike it rich and leave. Nobody was building for the next generation because nobody thought they'd still be there. This was a smash-and-grab operation disguised as a society. This was the environment. No family, no community, no church, no law, no stability, no future. Just gold, violence, and the absolute certainty that you were on your own. And in that environment, morality didn't just weaken, it shattered completely. Let me show you exactly how daily survival in early California started breaking down your moral framework, piece by piece, decision by decision. You arrive in California with your morals intact. You're a good person. You believe in honesty, fairness, helping others. You've got principles. Let's see how long they last. First day, you need shelter. There are no available cabins, no rooms to rent. Everything's taken. You have three choices. Sleep outside in the cold, pay an absolutely criminal price for a canvas tent, or take shelter that someone else has abandoned temporarily. The honest choice is to pay. But that tent costs a week's wages, money you don't have yet because you haven't found any gold. So you sleep outside. You spend the night shivering, unable to rest, listening to people walking past in the dark. It's miserable, but you kept your principles. You feel good about that. Second day, you're exhausted from not sleeping. You need food. The prices are insane. A simple breakfast costs the equivalent of $40 in today's money. You have limited funds. If you pay these prices, you'll run out of money before you find gold, and then you'll starve. You notice that supply wagons are poorly guarded. You could easily steal food. Everyone else is doing it, you've seen it happen. But you don't steal. Instead, you buy the smallest meal possible. You're still hungry, but you're honest. Your principles are holding, but you're suffering for them. Third day, you stake a claim and start working. The work is brutal. You're standing in freezing water for 14 hours, bent over, sorting gravel. Your back is screaming. Your hands are already blistering, and you find nothing, not a single flake of gold. You see other miners finding gold nearby. You start wondering if you're doing something wrong or if you just got unlucky with your claim location. Fourth day, you notice someone else's claim, 30 feet away, looks much more promising. There's better gravel, better water flow. The person working it found gold yesterday, you saw it. But right now, that claim is empty. The owner went to town for supplies. You could move your stake over. Nobody would know. It's not really stealing because you're staking unclaimed land, right? Except it is claimed. You know it is. You don't move your stake. You keep working your barren claim. But now you're starting to feel stupid. You're watching people cheat and prosper while you're following rules that nobody else follows. Your principles are feeling less like virtue and more like foolishness. Day 7, you still haven't found meaningful gold. You're running out of money. You haven't had a proper meal in days. You're weak, cold, and starting to get sick. Your tent mate, a man you barely know, strikes gold. Actual significant gold, enough to buy food for weeks. He's celebrating, showing it off. That night while he's asleep, you stare at his gold pouch sitting 2 feet away from you. You could take it. He'd assume he lost it or someone else stole it. You'd have food. You'd have time to find your own gold. You'd survive. You don't take it, but you thought about it seriously. That's new. A week ago, the idea wouldn't have even crossed your mind. Now you're calculating angles, justifying it to yourself. The moral framework is cracking. Day 14, you're sick now, probably dysentery from the contaminated water. You can barely work. You need medicine, but medicine costs money you don't have. Your tent mate, the one who found gold, is healthy and working his claim. He's finding more gold while you're deteriorating. You ask him for help, just a loan enough to buy medicine. You'll pay him back when you strike gold. He refuses, says everyone's struggling, he needs his gold for himself. He's not wrong, he doesn't owe you anything. But you helped him set up his equipment last week. You shared your coffee with him, and now he's watching you get sicker and refusing to help. Here's what breaks in your mind. You realize that helping people doesn't matter. Being kind doesn't create reciprocity. Your good deeds were wasted on someone who sees you as a competitor, not a community member. The lesson is clear. Compassion is a one-way transaction that leaves you weaker. Day 21. You're recovering from the sickness, but you're broke. Completely out of money. You haven't eaten in 2 days. Your claim still hasn't produced gold. You're starting to understand that you're going to die if something doesn't change. A merchant offers you a job hauling supplies for a week. The pay is enough to buy food. You take it. While hauling, you discover that this merchant is selling rotten food at premium prices. You see him mixing sawdust into flour, watering down whiskey, selling spoiled meat that he knows will make people sick. You're helping him do this. By hauling his supplies, you're complicit. Do you quit? If you quit, you don't eat. Your principles say you should quit. Your stomach says you should shut up and haul. You keep hauling. You tell yourself it's not really your fault, you're just moving boxes. But you know you're part of a system that's poisoning people. The moral framework cracks a little more. Day 30, you go back to your claim. Someone has jumped it while you were working the merchant job. There's another man working it now, with 2 armed friends standing guard. They tell you to get lost. You try to argue, show your stake papers. They laugh at you. One of them shows you his gun. You leave. You just walk away from 3 weeks of work and your legal claim, because what choice do you have? You could fight, but you'd die. You could report it to a minors' court, but you've seen those courts. They side with whoever has more armed friends. Here's what breaks now: your belief in justice. Your belief that legal right matters. You did everything correctly, followed all the rules, and you were robbed anyway. The system failed you. Worse, there is no system. There's only power, and you don't have any. Day 45, you stake a new claim further out, harder to reach. You're working it alone, paranoid, sleeping with a knife. You find gold. Not much, but real gold. Enough to eat, finally. You're holding it in your hand, feeling relief for the first time in weeks. Then you see another miner nearby struggling. His equipment broke. He's asking for help, offering to pay. A month ago, you'd have helped him immediately. Now you're calculating. If you help him, you lose work time. If his claim is good and you help him succeed, he becomes competition. If you don't help him, he might fail and leave, and you could take his claim. You don't help him. You lie and say you're too busy. You watch him struggle and fail over the next week. Then, when he abandons his claim, you expand into his area. You took advantage of someone else's suffering for your own gain. That's the person you've become. And you did it by making small, rational decisions, every single one of which made perfect sense given the circumstances. You didn't wake up one day and decide to become immoral. You were systematically broken down by an environment that punished virtue and rewarded vice. The work itself, the daily grind of mining and surviving, was a morality-destroying machine. Let me show you exactly how the economic system in early California turned decent people into exploiters and monsters. The fundamental problem was that honest work didn't pay. The average miner, working 12 to 16 hours a day in brutal conditions, made barely enough to survive after expenses. Most miners lost money over time. The people getting rich weren't the ones working honestly. They were the ones cheating the system. Here's how it worked. You could mine honestly, finding maybe $5.10 of gold per day on average. That sounds decent until you realize your expenses were $8.12 per day. Food, tools, claim fees, tent space, it all added up. You were working yourself into disability for the privilege of slowly going broke. Or you could cheat. You could jump claims, taking weeks of someone else's work in one violent encounter. You could high grade, working someone else's claim and stealing their best ore while pretending to mine your own area. You could salt claims, planting gold to trick buyers into paying huge prices for worthless land. The honest choice made you poor. The dishonest choice made you successful. And you couldn't just abstain from the game because poverty in California wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Being broke meant starving, freezing, dying of preventable illness. So people broke. They made the calculation, steal or die. And they stole. Men who'd never committed a crime in their lives became thieves because the alternative was death. And once you cross that line once, crossing it again gets easier. The merchants and business owners faced the same moral calculations, and most of them failed spectacularly. You could run an honest store, charging fair prices and selling quality goods. You'd go bankrupt within months because your competitor was charging triple and selling garbage, and desperate miners had no choice but to pay. Or you could become a predator. You could buy flour for pennies and sell it for dollars. You could water down medicine, mix sawdust into food, sell rotten meat as fresh. You could pay your workers starvation wages while you got rich. You could loan money at 10% interest per month, knowing people would default, then seize everything they owned. The honest merchants went broke. The predatory merchants became California's founding business elite. That was the lesson: exploit or fail, and people learned it quickly. Employment was just as corrupting. If you were an employer, you could pay fair wages and provide safe conditions. But that cost money, which meant your competitor who paid starvation wages and ignored safety would underprice you and drive you out of business. So employers learned to see workers as disposable. Pay them as little as possible. Work them until they break. When they get injured, fire them and hire someone else. There's always another desperate person willing to work in deadly conditions for barely enough to eat. If you were a worker and you watched this happen, watched employers get rich by exploiting people like you, what did that do to your sense of morality? It taught you that human life has no value. That suffering is just the cost of business. That the people succeeding are the ones willing to destroy others. Some workers internalized that and became exploiters themselves the moment they had the chance. The foreman who'd been abused as a worker became an abuser when promoted. The miner who'd been cheated became a cheater when he had the opportunity. Victimhood didn't create solidarity. It created a determination to become the victimizer next time. The boom-bust cycles made everything worse. A claim would be rich, then played out. A town would boom, then collapse. You'd invest everything in a location, then have to abandon it and start over with nothing. This constant instability meant you couldn't build anything long-term. You couldn't develop trust or relationships. You had to grab what you could right now because tomorrow it might all disappear. This created a scarcity mindset that poisoned morality. You didn't share because you might need it later. You didn't help others because you'd need your resources for the next crisis. You hoarded, lied about what you had, and watched other people suffer while you protected your own survival. The wealth inequality made it even more morally corrosive. You'd be starving in a tent while watching merchants live in luxury off your exploitation. You'd see claim jumpers and thieves getting rich while honest miners died in poverty. The message was unmistakable. Crime pays. Honesty doesn't. Morality is for suckers. And here's the worst part. Even people who recognized this corruption often participated in it because they needed to survive. You knew the merchant was cheating you, but you bought from him anyway because you had no choice. You knew your employer was exploiting you, but you worked anyway because starving was worse. You knew the system was evil, but you participated because opting out meant death. That participation, that complicity, eroded your moral foundation. You couldn't maintain the belief that you were a good person while you were actively supporting and enabling evil systems. So you adjusted your morality to match your behavior. You told yourself it was necessary, that everyone did it, that you had no choice. And maybe you were right. But those justifications, repeated daily, rewired how you thought about right and wrong. Within months, People who'd come to California with strong moral principles had completely inverted their ethics. Stealing wasn't wrong if you needed to survive. Exploitation wasn't wrong if everyone did it. Violence wasn't wrong if it protected your interests. The work, the poverty, the impossible economic pressures, they didn't just change behavior. They changed what people believed was morally acceptable. Nothing breaks human morality faster than watching people die and realizing that helping them will kill you too. Early California turned death into a moral teacher, and the lesson it taught was brutal. Compassion is fatal. Disease was everywhere, and it spread through the mining camps like wildfire through dry grass. Cholera was the worst. You'd see someone healthy in the morning, hear they had diarrhea at noon, and find their corpse by evening. Cholera killed so fast and so brutally that entire camps would panic, people fleeing in all directions, abandoning the sick to die alone. Here's the moral breaking point. You'd see your tent mate get cholera. The compassionate response is to care for him, get him water, keep him comfortable, try to help. But caring for a cholera patient means close contact, which means you'll probably get cholera too. And then you'll die. So you have a choice. Be a good person and probably die, or abandon a dying man and probably live. What do you choose? Most people chose to live. They'd wake up to find their partner showing symptoms, and they'd pack their things and leave before noon. They wouldn't even say goodbye. They'd just disappear, leaving the sick person to die alone because staying meant risking death. And here's what that did to morality. It taught you that human connection is dangerous, that caring about others is a survival risk, that the rational, smart choice is to treat people as disease vectors rather than as humans deserving compassion. That's not a lesson you unlearn easily. Scurvy created similar moral collapses. Fresh food prevented scurvy, but fresh food was extremely expensive and scarce. If you had access to vegetables or fruit, you could eat them yourself and stay healthy, or share them with others and risk running out before you could get more. Death became so common that it lost meaning. In the mining camps, people died every day from disease, accidents, violence, or simple exposure. Bodies were buried in shallow graves, or sometimes not buried at all, just left where they fell if nobody wanted to take the time. You'd walk past corpses. You'd step over bodies. You'd go through dead men's belongings looking for anything useful, and you wouldn't feel bad about it because if you didn't take it, someone else would. You'd see a man die and your first thought wouldn't be grief or horror. It would be calculating whether his claim was worth staking or whether his tent had better equipment than yours. That's what constant death does to morality. It makes human life feel cheap. It makes death feel normal. It turns people into resources to be exploited rather than individuals to be mourned. The medical system, such as it existed, was just as morally corrupting. Doctors in early California were often quacks or incompetents who charged outrageous fees for treatments that didn't work and sometimes made things worse. They'd bleed patients who needed fluids, dose them with mercury that poisoned them, perform amputations that killed through infection. But if you were sick or injured, you had no choice but to trust them and pay their fees. You'd spend your last gold on a doctor who might kill you faster than the disease would. And the doctors, many of them knew their treatments were useless, but they charged anyway because people were desperate. They made fortunes off suffering they couldn't actually alleviate. This taught people that medicine, healing, and care, things that should be about compassion, were actually just another scam. Just another way the powerful exploited the desperate. It poisoned the idea that helping professions were moral endeavors. Everything became transactional. Everything became exploitation. And through all of this, you learned the core lesson. In early California, caring about others was a liability. Compassion was weakness. The people who survived were the ones who could watch suffering without flinching and see death as opportunity. The moral framework that says human life has inherent value, that we have obligations to help each other, that community matters, all of that collapsed under the weight of constant, overwhelming death that punished anyone who tried to care. If disease taught people that compassion was fatal, Crime and lawlessness taught them that justice was a fairy tale and violence was the only reliable tool for protecting yourself. This is where moral frameworks didn't just crack, they shattered completely. There was essentially no functioning law enforcement in most of California. The mining camps had no sheriffs, no deputies, no police. San Francisco and Sacramento had corrupt officials who were often more criminal than the people they were supposedly policing. The message was clear: there is no authority coming to save you. You're on your own. In that environment, what stops you from committing crimes? Normally, it's a combination of moral belief that crime is wrong, fear of punishment, and social pressure from your community. In early California, all three of those restraints disappeared. Moral belief eroded quickly when you saw criminals prospering and honest people failing. Fear of punishment evaporated when there was no punishment. Social pressure vanished when communities were temporary and anonymous. You could rob someone, move to the next camp, and nobody would ever know. So crime exploded. And here's what that did to people's morality. It taught them that the only thing protecting you from becoming a victim was your willingness to become a perpetrator first. Claim jumping was the perfect example. Your claim would be jumped. Someone would forcibly take it while threatening violence. You'd have no legal recourse. The miners' court would side with whoever had more friends. You'd lose everything you'd worked for. What do you do next? The moral choice is to accept the loss, stake a new claim, and keep following the rules. But you just learned that following the rules makes you a victim. So instead, you jump someone else's claim. You get a few friends with guns, you intimidate some weaker miner, and you take what he's worked for. You've become the thing that victimized you. But in your mind, you're not evil, you're adapting. You're learning how the system actually works and refusing to be a victim again. That's how people justified it. That's how they maintained the belief that they were still good people while committing acts they'd have found horrifying months earlier. Theft became ubiquitous and morally neutral. Everyone stole. You stole equipment, gold, food, supplies. If you didn't steal, you were either rich enough not to need to or stupid enough to keep suffering unnecessarily. Stealing stopped being a moral question and became a practical one. Can I get away with it? And here's what that does to your entire moral framework. If stealing is okay, then property rights don't exist. If property rights don't exist, then what does ownership even mean? It just means whatever you can hold on to by force. That's not a society, that's anarchy with extra steps. Violence became the default conflict resolution tool. Someone insults you, fight them. Someone owes you money, threaten them. Someone is on land you want, shoot them. There were no nonviolent resolution mechanisms that worked reliably, so violence became rational. And violence corrupts morality in a specific way. It teaches you that might makes right. The person with the gun wins the argument. The person willing to kill gets what they want. Truth, justice, fairness, all of that is irrelevant compared to the ability to inflict harm. Once you accept that framework, you've abandoned the fundamental principle of civilization, that disputes can be resolved through reason, law, and shared moral principles. You've reverted to pure power dynamics. And you can't believe in moral absolutes when you've internalized the idea that whoever has the biggest gun determines what's right. Vigilante justice emerged as supposedly a solution to lawlessness, but it actually made the moral collapse worse. Vigilance committees would form, claim to represent law and order, and then lynch people without trials. Sometimes they lynched actual criminals. Often they lynched business rivals, political opponents, or just people they didn't like. And the public supported it. People cheered at lynchings. They saw extrajudicial murder as necessary and good. Because in a world without functioning law, mob violence felt like the only way to create safety. But here, that's what supporting vigilantism does to your morality. It teaches you that murder is acceptable if you can justify it. That process, evidence, and rights don't matter. That if a group of people agrees someone deserves to die, then killing them is righteous. That's not justice. That's mob rule. And once you accept mob rule as legitimate, you've lost the ability to distinguish between justice and revenge, between lawful authority and organized violence. The gambling culture made it all worse. Gambling was everywhere, in saloons, in camps, in streets. And it wasn't just cards and dice. Everything became gambling. Claims were gambled away. Businesses were bet on single hands of poker. Men would gamble their entire fortunes and end up destitute or wealthy based on pure chance. This taught people that work, planning, and virtue didn't determine outcomes, luck did. And if luck determines everything, then why be moral? Why work hard? Why plan for the future? Just take risks, cheat when you can, and hope you get lucky. That's a fundamentally amoral worldview. It removes agency and responsibility. It makes life feel random and meaningless. And people living in that mindset don't follow moral codes. They follow impulses and opportunities. The prostitution and sex trade revealed the moral collapse in its starkest form. Women were trafficked into California and forced into prostitution. Everyone knew it was happening. Men who would have been horrified by slavery nonetheless purchased sex from enslaved women and told themselves it was fine because the women were willing. That cognitive dissonance, knowing something is evil but participating anyway and rationalizing it, that's the final stage of moral collapse. You've moved beyond breaking moral rules to actively redefining morality to excuse your own behavior. That's what lawlessness did. It didn't just remove external constraints on behavior. It destroyed people's internal moral compasses by teaching them that justice doesn't exist, violence is necessary, and the only real crime is being weak enough to become a victim. The treatment of the vulnerable in early California reveals the moral collapse at its absolute worst, because these were the people who couldn't fight back, couldn't leave, and couldn't protect themselves. And the way California treated them shows just how completely human morality had broken down. Women in early California existed in a state of constant vulnerability. The gender imbalance, sometimes 90 men to every woman, created a situation where women were simultaneously valued as scarce resources and treated as objects without rights or autonomy. The few married women who came west found themselves isolated, overworked to the point of collapse, and utterly dependent on husbands who knew their wives had nowhere to go. Domestic violence was rampant and completely unpunished. A man could beat his wife bloody, and nobody would intervene because it was private family business. But the real moral horror was how quickly supposedly decent men abandoned their principles regarding women's dignity and autonomy. Men who'd been raised to respect women became clients of forced prostitution. They knew the women were trafficked, knew they were enslaved, knew they were suffering. They paid anyway. The rationalization went like this: I'm not the one forcing her. I'm just a customer. If I don't do it, someone else will. She's going to suffer either way, so my individual choice doesn't matter. That's moral collapse. That's how good people participate in atrocities while maintaining the belief that they're not responsible. The prostitutes themselves, many of them Chinese women who'd been literally sold and shipped to California, lived in conditions that were unambiguously slavery. They were locked in brothels, beaten if they refused customers, worked until they died from disease or violence. Their average lifespan in the trade was a few years, and the men of California knew this. They saw it. They created the demand that sustained it. And they did nothing to stop it because stopping it would have required moral courage they no longer possessed. Children faced their own particular horror. The few children in early California were forced to grow up fast, often working dangerous jobs by age 8 or 10. Boys worked in mines, hauled equipment, did manual labor that destroyed their growing bodies. Girls were married off young, sometimes to much older men, to reduce the burden on families or to secure business arrangements. Nobody protected children. There were no child labor laws, no compulsory education, no social services. If your parents died, which happened constantly, you were an orphan in a world that saw orphans as burdens or opportunities for exploitation, not as vulnerable children needing protection. Some orphans were taken in by charitable individuals or institutions. Many more became street children, begging, stealing, or being exploited in ways that are horrifying to contemplate. And the people of California walked past these suffering children every day and did nothing, because compassion for someone else's child was a luxury they couldn't afford. That's moral collapse. When a society stops protecting its most vulnerable members, stops seeing children as deserving of special protection and care, it's abandoned one of the most fundamental human moral principles. The treatment of immigrants was systematic, legally sanctioned moral atrocity. The Chinese faced the worst of it, and the way white Californians treated them reveals just how completely the moral framework had collapsed. Chinese minors were forced to pay the foreign minors tax, a deliberately racist law designed to extract money from non-white minors. It was enforced violently. Tax collectors, backed by armed men, would descend on Chinese camps and demand payment. Those who couldn't pay were beaten, robbed of their equipment, and driven away. The Chinese couldn't testify in court against white people, which meant white people could rob, assault, rape, or murder Chinese immigrants with complete impunity. And they did, regularly. Massacres of Chinese workers happened multiple times with dozens killed, and the perpetrators faced no consequences. Think about what that does to morality. If you're a white miner and you know you can murder a Chinese person without punishment, what restrains you? Only your internal moral belief that murder is wrong. But if you're starving and that Chinese miner has gold, and you know you can take it by force without consequence, what do? Many people chose murder and theft. They justified it with racism, telling themselves that Chinese lives didn't matter as much, that they were taking jobs from white men, that they deserved it. But underneath the racism was the simple calculation: I can take what I want by force, and nobody will stop me. That's not morality. That's predation with a racial justification attached to make it feel acceptable. The Native Americans faced actual genocide. Let me be clear about this. The treatment of Native Californians during the Gold Rush was genocide by any definition. Systematic mass murder, enslavement, deliberate starvation, and cultural destruction with the explicit goal of eliminating Native populations. White Californians hunted Native people for sport. The state government paid bounties for Native scalps and body parts. Militias would raid Native villages, murder everyone they could find, and kidnap the survivors, especially children, to sell as slaves. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't secret. This was open, public policy that supposedly civilized people supported and participated in. And here's the moral horror. Many of the people participating in or supporting this genocide were people who would have considered themselves moral, Christian, civilized individuals. They'd rationalized it. Native people were savages. They were in the way of progress. They were dangerous. Therefore, eliminating them was necessary, even righteous. That's how moral collapse works. You don't abandon your belief that you're a good person. You just redefine what good means to excuse whatever you want to do. The enslavement of Native Americans under the apprenticeship laws showed the moral collapse in legislative form. California, which entered the Union as a free state, immediately passed laws allowing the enslavement of Native Americans. White settlers could legally kidnap Native children, claim them as apprentices, and force them to work without pay until adulthood. Everyone knew this was slavery. They called it apprenticeship, but it was slavery. And the supposedly anti-slavery population of California supported it, participated in it, and profited from it, because their moral opposition to slavery apparently only applied to black people in the South, not to Native people in their own state. That's the ultimate moral collapse, maintaining the belief that you're morally superior while actively participating in atrocities that you would condemn if others did them. That level of cognitive dissonance, that ability to hold completely contradictory moral positions simultaneously, shows how thoroughly early California had broken people's ability to think clearly about right and wrong. If we're identifying the single moment when the moral collapse of early California reached its absolute nadir, it's the period from 1850 to 1853, particularly during the height of the San Francisco Vigilance Committees and the intensification of Native American genocide. Imagine it's 1851. You've been in California for a year now. You came with principles. You were a good person. You believed in law, justice, fairness, and human dignity. Let me show you who you've become. You're standing in Portsmouth Square in San Francisco, part of a crowd of thousands, watching the Vigilance Committee hang a man named John Jenkins. He was accused of stealing a safe. There was no trial, no due process, no opportunity for defense. The Vigilance Committee grabbed him, declared him guilty, and are now executing him publicly. The crowd is cheering. You're cheering. Because you've been robbed 3 times this year, and finally, someone is doing something about crime. Finally, there's punishment. Finally, there's order. You don't think about the fact that Jenkins might be innocent. You don't think about the fact that theft doesn't warrant execution. You don't think about the fact that mob murder is itself a crime. You just feel satisfaction that someone is being punished, and that makes you feel safer. That's who you've become. Someone who cheers at extrajudicial execution because you've lost faith in every other mechanism for justice. Or maybe you're not in San Francisco. Maybe you're in the foothills, part of a militia that's been organized to solve the Indian problem. You're riding toward a native village at dawn. You're carrying weapons. You know what you're about to do. A year ago, the thought would have horrified you. Mass murder of men, women, and children. You'd have been disgusted. You'd have refused. You'd have reported the people planning it to authorities. But now you've been told that native people are stealing livestock, attacking minors, threatening settlements. You've been told they're savages, that they'll kill you if you don't kill them first. You've been told this is necessary for survival and progress. And you believe it. Not because you're uniquely evil, but because you've spent a year in an environment that systematically destroyed your moral resistance to atrocity. You've learned that violence works. You've learned that the vulnerable are exploited by everyone. You've learned that us versus them is the only framework that matters, so you participate in a massacre. You kill people who were sleeping, who were unarmed, who were just trying to survive like you. And afterward, you tell yourself it was necessary. That they would have done the same to you. That this is just how the world works. That's moral collapse. That's what early California did to people. Or maybe you're a merchant who's made a fortune selling poison supplies. You know your food is adulterated. You know your medicine is fake. You know people are dying from what you sell them. But you keep selling because stopping would mean losing your business to a competitor who'd do the same thing. You've become a person who profits from death. You've become a person who can watch people suffer from your actions and feel nothing except concern about your profit margins. You've lost the ability to empathize with your victims, because seeing them as human beings would make your business model psychologically unbearable. This was the darkest period because this was when the moral collapse became normalized, systematized, and institutionalized. It wasn't just individuals making terrible choices anymore. It was society collectively deciding that atrocity was acceptable, even necessary. It was the moment when California stopped being a place where good people were struggling against bad conditions and became a place where the conditions had successfully turned most people bad. Let's talk about the difference between early California and modern California in terms of moral frameworks, because the contrast is staggering. Then, you lived in a world where there was no reliable justice system, so violence was the only way to protect yourself. Where there was no social safety net, so compassion for others meant risking your own death. Where there were no enforced laws protecting the vulnerable, so exploitation was just good business. Where there was no community stability, so you treated everyone as a temporary competitor rather than a potential long-term neighbor. In that world, maintaining moral principles meant suffering. Being kind meant being weak. Being honest meant being poor. Being compassionate meant being victimized. The system punished virtue and rewarded vice at every turn, and most people faced with those incentives chose survival over morality. Now, you live in a world with functioning courts, police, and laws. They're imperfect, often unjust, sometimes corrupt, but they exist. You can report crimes and have a reasonable expectation that they'll be investigated. You can resolve disputes without violence. You can appeal to authority instead of forming a lynch mob. You have social safety nets. If you get sick or injured, you're not automatically doomed. There's Medicare, Medicaid, disability support, unemployment insurance, food stamps. They're not generous, they don't solve everything, but they exist. Showing compassion for someone in need doesn't automatically doom you to starvation. You have labor laws, consumer protections, civil rights legislation. Employers can't work you to death without consequence. Merchants can't sell you poison. People can't be enslaved or genocided legally. Again, these protections are imperfect and often inadequately enforced, but they exist. There's a framework that says exploitation is wrong and should be punished. You have stable communities and long-term relationships. You live in the same place for years or decades. Your neighbors are people you'll know long-term, which creates social pressure to treat them decently. Your reputation matters because you can't just move to the next camp and start over anonymously. This creates an environment where morality is sustainable, where being kind doesn't doom you, where honesty is often rewarded or at least not automatically punished, where you can maintain moral principles without sacrificing survival. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between a world where moral behavior is rational and one where it's suicidal. Modern California has massive problems: inequality, homelessness, wildfires, political dysfunction, sky-high costs of living, racial injustice. But it doesn't systematically destroy people's moral frameworks the way early California did. You can live here and remain a decent person. You can help others without it being fatal. You can believe in justice without being laughably naive. That's the gift of living now instead of then. You get to have morals. You get to be good without dying for it. So here we are. This is how early California broke human morality, not through some unique evil in the people who came here, but through a system that made vice rational and virtue fatal. It took normal people, people who believed in God, law, fairness, and human dignity, and put them in an environment where all of those beliefs became liabilities, where every moral choice came with a survival cost, where compassion meant weakness, honesty meant poverty, and justice was a fantasy only fools believed in. And most people broke, not because they were uniquely evil, but because humans are adaptable, and we adapt our morality to match our environment. When the environment punishes goodness and rewards cruelty, people become cruel. When it makes exploitation profitable and fairness expensive, people become exploiters. When it turns empathy into a survival risk, people shut off their empathy. That's the horrifying lesson of early California. Given the wrong conditions, almost anyone can become a monster. You want to believe you'd be different, that you'd maintain your principles no matter what. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence suggests that you, like most people, would adapt, rationalize, and become a version of yourself you'd never have imagined possible. The people who succeeded in early California, the ones whose names are on buildings and streets, who founded dynasties and businesses that still exist, many of them succeeded by abandoning morality. They exploited, stole, killed, and destroyed, and they got rich doing it. Their descendants inherited that wealth and status, and nobody talks about the moral collapse that created it. Meanwhile, the people who tried to maintain their decency, who refused to participate in atrocities, who chose virtue over survival, most of them failed, suffered, and disappeared from history. Their sacrifice meant nothing in material terms. That's not a satisfying moral. It's not a story where goodness triumphs. It's a reminder that systems matter, that the rules, laws, and institutions we build determine whether moral behavior is sustainable or suicidal. That civilization isn't natural. It's a constant, deliberate effort to create conditions where people can afford to be good. We live in those conditions now, imperfect as they are. You can be kind without dying for it. You can be honest without starving. You can care about others without it destroying you. That's not because we're better people than our ancestors. It's because we built better systems. Remember that. Protect those systems, because they're all that stands between us and the moral collapse that consumed early California. If you found this story disturbing, meaningful, or important, share it. Talk about it. remember it. Because the people who suffered through California's moral collapse, who maintained their humanity despite everything, or who lost it despite their best intentions, they all deserve to be remembered for what they endured and what it cost them. And if you want to understand how other states broke their people in different ways, how other frontier societies created their own moral nightmares, stick around. History is full of these stories, and every one of them is a reminder that the thin veneer of civilization we take for granted is precious, fragile, and worth protecting. Thanks for watching.